What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and today I am going to be talking about a Star Wars piece of media that I have not discussed thoroughly in the past. I made a video last year talking about the Siege of Mandalore from Season 7 of the Clone Wars, and that was when I didn't have Disney Plus, and I basically just watched it through, clips and snippets on YouTube, and I didn't really get all of it. I don't know why I made that video. I was just I watched clips and I was I think I get most of the plot, so I'm just gonna make a video. I don't know why I did that. But I did watch through Clone Wars, all the essential episodes and stuff, and even ones that I didn't really think were essential or that other people didn't deem to be essential, but that I thought kind of sounded entertaining, like this one arc in Season 6 where Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks go on a buddy cop adventure together, and it was actually very entertaining. I did not expect to enjoy it as much as I did, but I wanted to make a video on the Clone Wars because I made a video on Rebels, and I made a video on Rebels recently, so I was I want to make a video on Clone Wars. I've already talked about Mandalorian. I've been talking about Bad Batch, so I was what can I really talk about the Clone Wars, though, that hasn't already been said? It's an excellent TV show, and all the seasons have at least some redeeming elements to them. Every season at least has one good episode or a good arc or something, and there's usually just a couple episodes in a season that are kind of weak. And I finally figured out what I wanted to talk about, and that is that I feel that Clone Wars Season 7 is actually one of the worst seasons of the show. Percentage-wise, because if we're thinking about it, the Siege of Mandalore, the final arc of the Clone Wars, the final 4 episodes, episodes 9, 10, 11, and 12 of Season 7 of the Clone Wars, are arguably some of the best material in the entire show and some of the best material in Star Wars in general. They're beautifully animated and beautifully told story-wise. I can't really pick apart any problems with the final 4 episodes. And I know that other people have kind of touched on this, but probably not to the same extent that I'm going to in this video. Everything else in that season is pretty subpar. And I've already heard people talk about the fact that, the everything else just doesn't live up to those final episodes. The other arcs don't feel like final season material, which is true. But I wanted to really talk about why I feel these other 2 arcs, the Bad Batch and then the Martez sisters, why do people not like them very much? Why do people dislike them, and why do they feel they're so weak? So we'll start off with the Bad Batch arc. Now, this one feels the most detached from the final arc. I feel like the Martez sisters arc, at least does tie into the Siege of Mandalore slightly. I feel like they just kind of added that in at the last minute. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like kind of a tacked-on addition at the end just to have it tie in somehow. But the Bad Batch arc doesn't really feel like it has anything to do with the final arc of the Siege of Mandalore besides it being kind of a Rex-focused story. There are kind of some cute elements with Anakin that I enjoy in the Bad Batch arc, like him talking to Padme and Obi-Wan kind of revealing that he knows about his secret relationship with Padme, but just because of how good of friends they are, he doesn't reveal it to anybody. There are cute elements like that, and then Anakin attacking Trench at the end of the arc and kind of showing some of his, they kind of fall to the dark side. Stuff like that I don't mind. I enjoy stuff like that. But just in general, the story feels particularly weak and it lacks the gravity of what the story really is that they're telling. The main kind of plot, motivation, is that they need the Bad Batch to, use their unpredictable tactics because the Separatists have been predicting all of their tactics, and Rex recognizes that all of the tactics they're using are tactics that he and Echo came up with in the past. So that leads Rex to believe that somehow they found Echo's body and are using him, or that maybe he's still alive and they're just using all the data from his brain or something. And so Rex believes he's alive, but everyone else doesn't. And even Anakin is kind of look, you have to kind of prepare yourself for disappointment if he's not alive. But Rex is just determined that they're going to get Echo out. And eventually they do find out that Echo's alive. And obviously he does come back in the Bad Batch show. But just the whole setup feels like there's a whole bunch of kind of interesting concepts, but they don't play around with it. Or they don't play around with the concepts. Like, it feels like not what the earlier seasons of Clone Wars were really about. Like, the final arc brings back a lot of that. Like, there's an entire scene where Ahsoka and Rex talk about on the bridge of the Venator, like, the Clone War, and they reminisce, and, like, what was the purpose of the clones? And it's just this really nice philosophical discussion between two characters. And it takes its time, those final episodes. But I would argue that these final two arcs, like, before the Siege of Mandalore, feel like more like Rebels episodes. Like, I talked recently about Rebels and how some of the kind of side fillery adventure of the week, I guess, type episodes of that show had like fleeting moments where they had interesting concepts being played around with, but they'd often prefer to just kind of stuff in a lot of action and kind of goofy antics. And the Bad Batch arc kind of feels like that to me. The Martez Sisters arc feels like that more to like a more extreme extent. Bad Batch to a lesser extent, like that arc. But just the way that, there are kind of interesting moments that pass, and then they're just back to action. And it feels like each episode, just action scene after action scene of the Bad Batch, going through corridors, shooting people, stabbing them with knives, and fighting droids, And that's kind of just what the arc is. It feels like there's not a lot of takeaway from it. Like, I thought it was kind of important to establish how Echo became a part of the Bad Batch, but when you see the context of it, it doesn't really make sense why he joins them. Like, they find Echo, and then through the entire, like, last episode, the Bad Batch, like, Tech and some of the other guys are all, like, kind of being like, oh, maybe he's working with the Separatists or something, and, like, they let him go, and he has knowledge, and he's actually on their side, and they brainwashed him or something, which I guess is a valid concern to some extent, but they're all, like, kind of against Echo throughout the entire episode. So then at the end, it feels weird where Rex is like, these are some of the finest. It just kind of feels cheesy, like, it feels cheap. And then they don't really fully explore, like, the concepts there, like the distrust that the Bad Batch have for Echo. They just randomly don't trust him, and they're like, maybe he's working for the Separatists. And they don't really talk about it that much, and then, like, by the end of it, Echo just decides to go with them because they're different like him, and Rex is, like, has some cheesy line where he's like, these are some of the finest soldiers I've ever fought alongside. If you think that's where you belong, then that's where you belong. And it just feels like really cheap. Like, so this is like it doesn't feel like there was it feels forced. Like, it feels like, okay, we have to have him be with them for the Bad Batch show. So he's just going to go with them because they're different, not because they're nice to him or because, like, he's actually even like them at all. Like, you see that in the Bad Batch show that he often disagrees with them. He and Hunter had a disagreement in episode 8. And, like, they don't always, like, agree on things, and that's because he's, like, a reg. So he's not even, like, personality-wise really like the rest of the Bad Batch. He's much more of, like, a stoic, cold kind of character, which makes sense, but it doesn't really make sense why he went with them. Like, the Bad Batch, honestly, like, and then even, like, the Bad Batch show does a better job of establishing them, because, like, you see the Bad Batch in action, they go and fight some people in the Clone Wars arc, but you don't see, like, their special abilities on display. Instead, they just have a scene where Hunter and the rest of the Bad Batch walk off the shuttle at the beginning, and he goes, here's Crosshair, he can shoot things from a mile away, and Tech, he's pretty smart, so we'll have him say some, like, smart-sounding thing, and then over here is Wrecker, and he's the demolition expert, and I'm really good at things. Like, it feels like way cheaper because they just show up and explain what they can do, but you don't actually see it. The way the Bad Batch show starts is you see each of the members of the Bad Batch in an action scene. Like, the opening scene of the Bad Batch series is the Bad Batch in an action scene fighting a bunch of droids, and you see each of their abilities. You see Crosshair, you see Wrecker, you see Tech, and Hunter. Like, you see all of them using their abilities to their advantages, and then you even see, like, later on when they're fighting the test droids on Kamino. So, and then after that, you have Kanan introduce them to Depa Billaba and the other clones or whatever. But they still established in a creative and fun action scene how their abilities function, rather than just having a kind of a silly scene where they just explain what they can do without actually showing it. It's a classic show don't tell type of situation. I think the Bad Batch show does a better job introducing them. Like my parents and I have been watching the Bad Batch TV show without having seen the Clone Wars arc, and they're following it perfectly fine. And it's just the Bad Batch arc feels really inconsequential. Like, it feels like it was just a bunch of action scenes, and they don't really explore anything interesting. Like, there's a lot of interesting things. Once again, I've talked about this in Bad Batch reviews that they could talk about with Echo and, the torture and everything that he experienced and stuff, and like how he should have PTSD. And it's very briefly touched on in the Clone Wars show, but then he's kind of just like, Rex is like, "How are you, buddy?" And he's like, "I got a big headache," or something, and makes like a quip, and it feels like really jarring. Like, it doesn't feel like this is the way this character would be acting after having his mind enslaved for years by the Separatists. It just feels considerably like lesser. Like the quality of the arc is just kind of like, it feels more like a Rebels type thing. Like, fleeting moments are kind of interesting, and then we just go back to having it like an action scene. There's also a really weak point where they go to this planet and they talk to these villagers. And then they make a deal with the villagers that they supply them with, like, these flying creatures, but then they say, "Don't bring the war to us," basically. And they make a deal with them, and then they end up bringing the war to them, but then they try to say some stupid thing where they're like, "The Separatists brought war to your planet by being here, even though we're the ones drawing out the Separatists to attack you," and then a bunch of the villagers end up getting killed, and they try to have this weird, like, ending where they're like, "Thank you for your help, you have been you've done a great service to the Republic," or some bullshit. But it's like, no, you literally, like, brought the Separatists to them and got them killed, and then you tried to act like it was the Separatists' fault. But no, it's your fault, you broke your promise. Right? There's just something that doesn't sit right about that to me. Like, it just, like, they weren't, the Separatists were on the planet, yes, but they weren't bothering with the villagers until the clones showed up, and then frickin' ended up getting a bunch of the villagers killed. Like, it doesn't feel like, it feels kind of weird. Like, it feels like, I guess that's kind of the point, is that the Republic is kind of, like, all built on hypocrisy. But just something about that doesn't sit right with me. Like, the way they tried to twist their words and be like, it was actually the Separatists' fault, even though it was their fault for not keeping their promise of keeping the village safe, and they just ended up getting a bunch of them killed. Just something about that just didn't sit right with me. And that's just, like I said, the Bad Batch arc just feels inconsequential. Like, I thought it was kind of important to set up the Bad Batch TV show, but it's really not. Like, if you start the Bad Batch show, they do a better job of introducing the characters than the Clone Wars did. The Clone Wars arc is kind of boring, like, with the Bad Batch, and it's just a bunch of, like, action that is just like, okay, it's better animated. Like, it looks good. The animation looks good. It looks better than all the prior seasons of the show, but, it's still just kind of like a better looking version of what we've already had multiple times before in the past of the Clone Wars show, just without taking the time to really delve deep into the concepts and themes that the earlier seasons of the show did. So that's my opinion on the Bad Batch arc. I think it's pretty weak. And then we have the Martez sisters arc. Now, this is the one that has gotten a lot of backlash, and for good reason. The Martez sisters' characters, to me, I find extremely irritating. I find them to just be, like, really annoying, like, uninteresting, unentertaining characters, or just not entertaining characters. They're just kind of like, they just feel like they don't try, and they just make dumb decisions, and then even Ahsoka just feels like she's acting considerably more childish. There are nice moments here and there in the arc. It looks nice. I think it looks even nicer than the Bad Batch arc did. But, there's just, like, the whole arc just feels, like, really slow. It's just not very investing. There's some kind of interesting elements when the sisters start talking about how their parents got killed by the Jedi, inadvertently, of course, and then the Jedi just didn't really do anything, and they just said, the Force will be with you or some shit, and then didn't actually do anything to help them, which is very interesting. The fact that the Jedi are kind of, once again, like, they're hypocrites, and they don't really, the thing is, the whole arc feels like there's no point to it, because I've seen people saying this, that, okay, people may not like it, it may be slow, but it still adds something to Ahsoka's character. It still, teaches her a lesson about the world of the Republic and how it's not so black and white or whatever. But that's literally what the whole point of the last arc was, with her being kicked out of the Jedi Order, her leaving the Jedi Order eventually, because of the hypocrisy of the Jedi, and because of the fact that, like Barriss Offee said, they have become warmongers in the conflict of the Clone Wars. They have become no better than the Sith and the Separatists that they are fighting against. She learned that from Barriss Offee, who framed her for the bombing of the Jedi Temple. That's a really interesting and compelling arc that is just done worse here. It's just, like, these people are just like, the Jedi inadvertently killed our parents, and now we don't like them. And so Ahsoka has to hide that she's a Jedi from them, and it's just this whole, like, roundabout, like, weak story. Like, there's nothing that really pulls me in about it. There's nothing really investing about it at all. I guess they come back in the Bad Batch, and those characters are slightly more tolerable there. But, like, I just find them extremely irritating here. They just make stupid decisions, and then Ahsoka feels like she's acting considerably more childish, despite the fact that she's meant to be older and more wise after her experiences. She's like, gets in arguments with the sisters, and they're like, it was Ahsoka's fault. And then Ahsoka's like, no, it wasn't my fault. And it starts to feel like a Rebels episode, like where the crew of, like, the Ghost and Ezra and Zeb are, like, fighting or whatever. Like, it doesn't feel like a Clone Wars, story. It's like the writing quality is so much weaker. Now, I did hear that the sisters were originally replaced by one character. I think it was like an Asian character or something. I don't remember the character's name, but he was going to be the first Asian lead in the Clone Wars show or something. And they replaced him with the sisters. So some dialogue scenes feel awkward because they basically had to recontextualize the dialogue to fit two different characters rather than one. And that guy was going to be a love interest for Ahsoka, like a new love interest rather than Lux Monteri. I don't really see the point of that, but whatever. But, like, that's why the dialogue can feel really weird. And, like, the first episode, it's kind of fun, but it's really inconsequential, and it just feels kind of like, okay. And then, like, as it goes on, it starts to feel more and more, like, pointless. And then, like, eventually there's the third episode where they escape jail and then end up back in the same jail. And the only thing of importance that happened in the entire episode was the sister's confession of what happened to their parents to Ahsoka. And then in the final episode, it's like, you could skip that. Like, the only one I would say is even somewhat important is the 8th one, because it has some elements of Darth Maul, and they reference Crimson Dawn from Solo, A Star Wars Story, and it kind of ties into the Siege of Mandalore, like a Bo-Katan shows up. But all that just feels, like, really weird. Like that whole, like, element of Bo-Katan being there and, like, the Pikes talking to Darth Maul, like, that makes sense because Maul, like, had recruited the Pikes or whatever. But, just the whole, like, element there with, like, Bo-Katan being on that planet, like, on Kessel or whatever. Like, why was she there? She's just, like, there with some other Mandalorians, and she's like, that's the Jedi that I met on that other planet from season 4. And it's like, but wait, why are you here? Like the whole, like, thing just feels weird. And then she just shows up and she's like, hey, Ahsoka, remember me? Remember me from season 4? Well, come with me and we'll go fight Darth Maul and reclaim Mandalore. And then they fly off. And it just feels, like, really tacked on. Like, there's not really a reason why Bo-Katan is there. She just shows up randomly, and it's like they try to say she's, like, looking for Ahsoka, but it's like, why would you go out of your way to look for Ahsoka? Why is Ahsoka so trusting of this person who, like, tried to murder her, like, a couple seasons ago? It doesn't really feel like the resolution is there. And then so Ahsoka, like, the way it ends feels really weird too. It's like Ahsoka ultimately ends up being revealed to them in the final episode that, oh, I am a Jedi. So then the sisters leave her, but then they go back to get her from Kessel, and then there's like this weird resolution where they're like mad at Ahsoka, and they're like, we don't like you because you're a Jedi. But then randomly they just change their mind in like 1 minute. They go from, I don't like you because you're a Jedi, to, but no matter what, you're our friend, or some bullshit. And it's like, you didn't treat me like your friend. Like, I don't feel like you're friendly. If I was Ahsoka, I'd be like, bullshit, I'm not your friend. Like, the whole like story there just feels so like, what was the resolution to that? They're just like, you're still our friend even though you're a Jedi, and we didn't like you 2 seconds ago, but we like you now because you like saved us or something. But like, it just feels like the whole arc just feels like, what was the point of this? Like, Ahsoka doesn't learn anything new. Like, that's the main argument that I've seen for it, is it does teach Ahsoka something new going into the final arc, into the Siege of Mandalore, and they needed to have, like, you know, one Rex-focused story and then an Ahsoka-focused story to go into the Siege of Mandalore. That's what Dave Filoni's reasoning was for why he chose these two to be a part of the final season. But why? Like, why these two in particular? The Bad Batch one, I get it. You have to establish them and set them up for their own TV show. But, like, this one in particular feels like, what was the point of choosing this one? Because the Ahsoka arc from Season 5 is a way better and more compelling story, and in a way better and more compelling version of this exact story. Ahsoka doesn't work with two random sisters she's never met. She ends up working with Ventress, a person who, you know, has been portrayed as a villain, but who ultimately ends up having more similarities to Ahsoka than they ever realized, and they end up being kind of a good team, you know? There's like a lot of interesting aspects to that story, and then it also ends with the same resolution. Ahsoka realizes that everything's not as black and white as she realized, and the fact that Barriss Offee does have a point. The Jedi, you know, they've kind of become warmongers, and then, you know, they have that one scene in episode 9 of the Siege of Mandalore, the first episode of Siege of Mandalore, and she says to Anakin, you know, I was reminded of what the Jedi mean to normal people, or whatever. And it's like, but yeah, they already had that whole story about the woman who put the nanobot bombs in her husband, and then he ended up blowing up the Jedi Temple hangar, and then it was actually Barriss Offee, and the reason why she manipulated this civilian was because a lot of the people, the regular people of Coruscant and just of the galaxy in general, disapprove of the Jedi. So Ahsoka already learned that in the arc from Season 5, in a more compelling and interesting story. Like, I don't find that boring at all, but here it's just she's hanging out with random girls she hasn't met before, and they're just like really useless, annoying characters that aren't fun to watch. And then, you know, they just randomly tie it into Darth Maul, and then they go off, and I guess they kept in contact after that point, because at some point she reconvened with them, and Rex stayed in contact with them, and then they end up meeting the Bad Batch and all that. So, okay. But, like, also, you know, you don't really need this show to give context for the Bad Batch. Like, you don't need this arc to give context for that. Like, they can just be random characters who met Rex at some point, and then he ends up meeting with them. Like, you don't need to have seen this, you know? And it just, if you jumped from, like, the first, like, I watched this show with my sister for the first time a couple, like, months ago, or at the beginning of the year. We jumped from the Ahsoka leaves the Jedi Order storyline to the Siege of Mandalore. And she followed it fine. She never felt like there were any pieces of information missing. And that's just how pointless those stories are. The Bad Batch one and the Martez sisters, like, especially the Martez sisters. And it just feels like, why did you choose these ones? Like, okay, the Bad Batch, I kind of understand, even if it's not the best arc ever, you know. Apparently there was going to be one with them and Yoda on Kashyyyk, and I'm like, that sounds more interesting, honestly, than this. But, like, I get why they chose that arc, because they had to set it up for the Bad Batch show, which they were planning on making, or they were already working on making. But, like, Why not make the other arc, like, we already have Ahsoka set up in the perfect position for the Siege of Mandalore at the end of her story from season 5. So why not make, what's the comic book series they made for Darth Maul, The Son of Dathomir? Why not make that into one of the arcs? Because Darth Maul is a key player in the final arc. Why not choose that one so then you have a little bit of context for him going into his final arc in the series, The Siege of Mandalore? Like, why not choose a Darth Maul storyline, or just, like, any of these other storylines, like, even though they don't have anything to do with the story, like, they sound more interesting than the Martez sisters, like the Boba Fett, Cad Bane arc, and just, like, all these cool ones that were never finished or finalized. And it's like, you can't, I've seen all these people saying, oh man, too bad we couldn't get this rather than the Martez sisters. Like, all that these people can think about, all of that the fans can think about, all I can think about is, what could we have gotten rather than the Martez sisters? Because there are so many other better arcs that would have been cool to see than the Martez sisters. Because it really is a pointless story. It doesn't develop Ahsoka in any way. It just retells the same... She learns the same lesson she learned in Season 5 of The Clone Wars, just in a less compelling way. And in a less entertaining way to watch, It's just not as entertaining to watch. So that's why I feel the Clone Wars Season 7, just in general, in total, is the weakest season. It's the shortest one, and, next to Season 6, which was 13 episodes, so it's one episode shorter. This one is 12 episodes. But, like, Season 6 had, like... I actually like all of Season 6. The Jar Jar Mace Windu one is not very important or compelling in any way, but it's very entertaining. I found it funny. I find the Clovis arc to be really interesting, and I find the Fives arc to be riveting, as well as the Yoda and the Force arc to be very mystical and interesting. Season 5, you have all the Darth Maul story, you have the Onderon story, you have Ahsoka leaving the Order. There's a lot of compelling stuff there. Season 4, you have the Umbara arc, you have... the Kadavo story, you have Darth Maul's return, Asajj Ventress's kind of redemption. Like, there's a lot of interesting elements in those seasons, and, like, I could go on for more. Like, Season 3, Season 2 has some really good ones. Even one of my favorite ones is the Boba Fett arc from Season 2. The final arc from Season 2 is focused on Boba Fett. That's one of my favorite Clone Wars storylines. So, like, you just think of all these, and, like, I honestly feel like the Bad Batch and the Martez sisters are some of the weakest stories from the Clone Wars, just overall. Like, even the arc from Season 5 of the Clone Wars focused around the Padawans and they encounter Hondo Ohnaka and stuff like that. Even that one has kind of an interesting story about, loyalty and trust and, Hondo and how he... is kind of puts on this facade, but deep down he does still care in a way, and he does end up going back for them in the end. Like, there's a lot of interesting elements there, none of which I feel are in the Bad Batch arc or in the Martez sisters arc from Season 7 of the Clone Wars. Like I've already said, the Siege of Mandalore is perfect. It's great. It's the best story from this show and one of the best Star Wars stories ever told. But when you look at the rest of the season, percentage-wise, it's pretty much the weakest one, at least in my opinion. Like, I watched Season 1 years ago, and I didn't like it, and I've never rewatched it. Season 2, I haven't watched all of it. I think most of it is kind of, like, skippable. But, just looking at Season 7 in general, how short it is, the length of it, and then the amount of stuff in it that is weak, is, like, most of the season. A majority of the season is weak. 8 out of the 12 episodes are, like, some of the weakest stuff of the show. So it's like you have the best story in the entire show mixed in with two of, in my opinion, the weakest stories in the show in general, at least of the ones that I've seen, and I've seen a lot. So that's kind of the video I wanted to make here. It's kind of like people have praised Season 7 and have said it's the best one, And that's just because of the Siege of Mandalore. Because if you look at the season as a whole, it's the weakest one, in my opinion. I love Siege of Mandalore. It's great. But when I look at Season 7, I only think of that. I don't think of the other two. So, yeah, that's why Season 7 of the Clone Wars, in my opinion, is the weakest one. And this is kind of an interesting video that I wanted to make. Because, I didn't want to retread what everyone else has said about how the Clone Wars is great. Because it is. So I didn't know what type of video to make on the Clone Wars. But then I realized, you know what? I think this is kind of an interesting video to make. Talk about how one of the most well-received, pieces of media to come out of this show and of Star Wars is actually one of the weakest seasons of the entire Clone Wars show. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of analysis in this video. I certainly enjoyed making it. You guys let me know, what's your opinion? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Just whatever your thoughts are, please let me know them all in the comments below. And of course, as always, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care.